Shouts that echoed across the parking lot caused him to freeze. The man pumping his gas at the 7-Eleven turned, and at the other pump stood a guy and a girl, early 20s, who were engaging in a heated argument. But as he watched closer, he realized that it wasn't so much an argument as it was a screaming girl trying desperately to get someone's attention as she defended herself against a violent boyfriend. And he came at her with his fists raised as she warned him not to touch her. "Shut up," was the boyfriend's response. Meanwhile, the man at the pump averted his eyes, focusing intently on the fuel nozzle instead. Cries of terror fell upon ears that desperately tried to remain deaf, until a sickening, flesh-on-flesh silenced the screams. The man pumping his gas quickly looked again, and this time the girl in the passenger seat was in tears. A bruise had already begun to appear on her face as her boyfriend slid into the driver's seat, with another glare and another command to be quiet. He managed to catch the girl's eye for only a moment, but unable to hold her gaze, his eyes fell. He holstered the fuel nozzle, slid into his car, and he never looked back as he drove away. Edmund Burke once said, "All that is required for evil to prevail is for good men to do nothing." And the story you've just heard illustrates this insightful truth. So today we'll consider two simple questions. What happens when good men do nothing? And what happens when good men do something? We'll evaluate our points from a historical perspective. And it's my hope that by the time we conclude, you and I will both understand the importance of Edmund Burke's words, and also our duty to act in the event of evil. But in considering what happens when good men do nothing, it seems most appropriate to consider that inaction that had a global impact. You see, 53 years ago, a man by the name of Elie Wiesel published his autobiography, entitled Night. Wiesel was a Jewish survivor from Auschwitz, the infamous Nazi death camp of World War II. And the book Night was a documentation of his experiences there as a prisoner. When I read it in 6th grade, I remember having nightmares for months and months to come. There was a question that Wiesel always returned to at night, almost as if the refrain to a sad song: how could the world keep silent? How could the world keep silent? He confessed that this was the very reason he didn't want to publish Night. He said those who kept silent yesterday will remain silent tomorrow. And he sensed an apathy, an indifference to the incidents of the Holocaust. How was it possible that daily thousands of people were being burned alive and the world did nothing? Well, Mark Sidwell, a PhD of U.S. history, says the U.S. was recovering from a depression. Britain was borderline bankrupt, and France, although possessing the largest army in the world at the time, didn't possess the motivation or morale to intervene. And although each ally did eventually join World War II, its grim death tally came to 50 million lives. And so we're left to wonder, how many of those lives could have been spared if the Allies had merely chosen to act sooner? Maybe his family, maybe even his friend, who was put to work in the crematorium and dealt the task of incinerating his own father. Britain, France, and the US were all afforded the opportunity to stop Hitler as he took Rhineland and Austria and Czechoslovakia, each time saying it was the last time. But as Mark Sidwell observed, Hitler wasn't taken seriously until it was too late. Because all that is required for evil to prevail is for good men to do nothing. But this brings us to our second point of consideration. What happens when good men do something? What happens when we witness injustice or evil and we act? Consider this. By the late 18th century, over 11 million African men, women, and children have been taken from their homes in Africa to be used as slaves in the West Indies and the American colonies. According to Cambridge lawyer and historian Michael Apted, the British Empire was built entirely on the backs of these slaves. And the slave trade was considered acceptable by all but a few. And yet of these few, even fewer were brave enough to speak against it. But British politician William Wilberforce said that the slave trade's wickedness was so dreadful that his mind was completely made up for abolition. And he determined that he wouldn't rest until he had effected its abolition. Because Wilberforce was shocked to learn that people were being chained together in cargo holds, forced to huddle in their own waste with dirt and disease, and endure horrendous torture at the hands of a ship crew, suffering this for nearly a month, as they were transported to distant shores where if they weren't, of the 20 to 30% who often died or were just thrown overboard, they would spend the rest of their lives as the property of another man, laboring without compensation. Wilberforce couldn't believe this. How could the British not see that it was wrong? And yet his political counterparts dubbed him a fanatic, of loathsome doctrine. But Wilberforce saw the great need, and he knew he had to do something, and so he replied, "If feeling alive to the sufferings of my fellow creatures is to be a fanatic, then I'm one of the most incurable fanatics ever permitted to be at large." And Wilberforce became at large. He began a campaign to end the British slave trade. He gave his life to the effort. He was elected into Parliament and introduced a legion of bills that continued to be defeated by pro-slavery politicians. But Wilberforce never ceased to be a voice for the slaves until he died in July of 1833. And a month later, Parliament passed the Slavery Abolition Act, which gave all slaves throughout the entire British Empire their freedom. Michael Apted explains that although Wilberforce didn't live to witness it, he helped bring an end to slavery throughout Great Britain. He acted in the event of evil. He did something. It made a lasting impact on our world. Because all that is required for evil to prevail is for good men to do nothing. And looking at what happens when good men do nothing, we see that people are hurt and lives can be lost, but incredible things happen when good men act. Solomon counsels us in Proverbs to open our mouths for you, for the rights of all who are destitute. Judges, we have a responsibility to intervene when evil occurs. And the examples we've looked at today may seem larger than life, but they're nothing more than examples of one person's silence, plus the silence of another, and another, maybe even you and me, until Hitler has conquered half of Eastern Europe, where 10 million innocent people are being shipped around the world like common cargo. Merchandise. These are only examples of when too many good men, or those with the potential to become good men, chose to remain silent. They chose to do nothing. Edmund Burke did say that all that is required for evil to prevail is for good men to do nothing. But there's an interesting paradox here. Because good men doing nothing, they aren't really good men at all. We've seen today that it's those who act, those who will do something in the event of evil that are regarded as the good men. And that's why I'd like to suggest to you that the occurrence of evil is an opportunity for us to be good men. Because we wouldn't think so highly of Wilberforce if he'd been content to stand aside and remain silent while others were being stripped from their homes and made into slaves. We wouldn't have reason to second-guess the Allies if they'd chosen to act the moment Hitler stepped outside of his boundaries. Because these were all breaking points. They were moments of decision when men or women had the opportunity to be good or be silent. Maybe even evil. Because as Elie Wiesel said, the opposite of love is not hate. It's indifference. And he said, indifference to me is the epitome of evil. And if we think of our story from the beginning, of the man at the gas station who witnessed a girl being abused and drove away, there's something I didn't tell you. That man at the gas station was me. And I imagine you might be wondering why I turned a blind eye, why I didn't intervene, and why I drove away. I asked myself the same questions. I wish I could tell you that I chose to act at that gas station, but I didn't. And so today, all I can acknowledge before you is the immense guilt that I've had to shoulder for the past 6 months, knowing that I witnessed such a thing, and I chose to do nothing. Elie Wiesel said that those who kept silent yesterday will remain silent tomorrow. But I want to prove him wrong. I think that we can prove him wrong. We don't need until tomorrow. We can start today. When evil occurs, we can do something, or we can do nothing. The question is, what will we do? Thank you. Thank you for judging, sir.